benchmarks of the demographic situation in Russia have become unavailable. There is no demography section in the latest review of the country's socio-economic situation for May. On the website of Росстат, the latest updates are dated March. Earlier, the publication of regional demographic statistics was stopped. Now the data are completely classified, so much so that even officials are willing to go to public conflict over the lack of reports. Demography is becoming a state secret. Citizens apparently should not know how rapidly the population is shrinking. The demographic crisis is becoming an obvious reality, but the authorities seem to stick to the logic. No numbers, no problem. Have the representatives of the authorities begun to ask questions that previously could not even be voiced? Why is the Kremlin hiding mortality statistics? Is it true that there are planned cuts in military spending? And if so, for what reason? Let's discuss it right now on the air. My name is Anastasia Noritsyna, and on the air is Igor Lipsits, Doctor of Economics. Hello, Igor. We have received information that the Federal State Statistics Service of Russia has stopped publishing data on mortality. Perhaps this is an attempt to hide the losses of Russia's armed forces during the conflict with Ukraine. Igor Vladimirovich, are the authorities really trying to hide the demographic situation? And could this mean that the army's human resource is nearing exhaustion?
Игорь Владимирович, Путин действительно пытается скрывать демографические проблемы страны, и это что значит, что заканчиваются вояки?
You showed a fragment of the Tsargrad channel, which represents the Orthodox nationalist part of the Russian public. For them, the topic of the disappearance of the population of indigenous nationality and religion is central. That is why they allow themselves to make public statements along the lines of, "The Russian people are dwindling, but we are not told about it." This illustrates the lack of a unified vertical of power. There are numerous separate structures and interests, which are weakly united and gradually diverge more and more. Each of these branches acts in its own interests and is beginning to assert itself, especially when political and social stability in the country is markedly declining. At the St. Petersburg Forum, Putin made a speech about the prospects for Russia's economic development. But a few days later he started talking about serious problems, including excessive military spending. Representatives of the economic bloc began to actively express concern about the state of affairs in the country, which forced the authorities to recognize the need to reduce them. This indicates the presence of internal contradictions and conflicts of interest, the lack of a unified logic in management. The system is gradually unraveling, instability is manifesting itself, and independent voices are emerging to criticize what is happening. This was particularly noticeable at the forum. Officials close to Putin spoke openly about the difficult situation in the country. Putin declares brilliant prospects for foreign business, while Gref states that there are no new investment projects for the year, even from Russian investors. This reflects the rocking of the system, where contradictory views emerge and everyone is looking out for their own interests rather than the president's. As a result, discord is intensifying. The demographic situation in the country is deteriorating, which looks especially cynical against the background of Putin's statement in December 2021 that the government's main task is to save the people. 3 months later, a war was launched in which people are killed and disabled. Words are at odds with actions. Russian officials continue to distort reality, creating the illusion of stability, while the level of pain, mortality, and declining birth rates become more and more evident. The situation cannot be remedied, and a process begins that may not be pleasant for Russians, the replacement of the local population with newcomers. Citizens are sent to the front, and their positions are taken by people from other countries. There are already predictions and plans to bring more than 150,000 workers from North Korea to Russia, as well as about 1 million Indians to work in the places of the departed military. A prospect is emerging in which foreigners will start families with local women and raise new citizens. The Kremlin hides soldier death data, blaming demographic decline on low birth rates while avoiding combat loss details. Now, in all district centers of the Zabaikalsky Krai, maternity wards have been reduced, and women are sent to give birth in the regional center. In the conditions of the region, this means traveling 650 kilometers on dirt roads. There have already been cases when women gave birth on the train, not having time to get there, because the transport goes according to the schedule, without taking into account emergency situations. And in the north, it is necessary to get there by airplane. In extreme cases, air ambulance is used, but flights to Shara, for example, are a significant expense. At the same time, it would be much more rational to keep a full-fledged gynecological department with a maternity unit in such settlements. Now there are only small perinatal halls left, which are barely functioning. No one answers questions about solutions. Everything is implemented according to the instructions of the Ministry of Health of Russia, despite the obvious difficulties. Gurulyov complains about potholes and dirt roads despite Russia's developed image. Meanwhile, the Ministry of Health orders maternity ward closures, raising questions about its real authority over worsening infrastructure. The Ministry of Health works within the budget approved by the Russian Ministry of Finance. The financial department's main priority is military expenditures, so there are practically no funds allocated for healthcare. The military budget is 13 trillion rubles, while healthcare gets only 1.4 trillion, 10 times less. This forces the ministry to close regional medical facilities, urging people to visit equipped centers. But with Russia's vast size and poor roads, even healthy people can struggle to reach them. Gurulyov is right. Logistics can be critical. A friend hunting in Nizhny Novgorod got a bear license, but even a visiting Dutch tourist had trouble reaching the area. A Dutch guest in Nizhny Novgorod took a 3-hour trip on dirt roads to the reserve. He found it too extreme, refused to hunt, and asked to return. This shows how harsh Russian roads are, hard even for a healthy person, let alone a woman in labor. The situation worsens as the government cuts medical spending and slashes federal road funding by 42%, worsening road quality. The Soviet saying, "In the USSR there were no roads, only directions," feels relevant again. The tariff for cold water increased by almost 15% in the first week. Hot water supply rose by 13 to 14%, sewage by 14.5%, heating by 13.8%. Fees for living in apartments of state and municipal housing stock increased by 1.5%. The cost of public transportation has also increased. It seems that it is becoming increasingly difficult for socially vulnerable citizens to live. With declining incomes, rising costs, and lack of effective support, poverty is becoming even deeper. The figures quoted do not reflect the whole picture, as these are federally regulated data. There are also tariffs set by regional authorities depending on the local situation. In a number of regions, the overall increase in housing and utility bills exceeds 20%, and, for example, in the Omsk region, it reaches about 40%. Pensioners are partially compensated, but families with children receive minimal assistance, which creates a serious burden. As a result, there is tension. The Ministry of Finance tries to shift the financial responsibility to the population. increasing their share of payment for utilities. Russia has a law limiting housing and utilities expenses in the family budget, above which state subsidies are given. Now, the norm may change so citizens get support sooner as living conditions worsen. The State Duma aims to protect people, while the Finance Ministry wants to shift costs to citizens. This lack of coordination shows agencies act independently, leaving Russians struggling and uncertain. The overall situation looks very alarming. In the first half of 2025, federal budget expenditures significantly exceeded revenues, and Silvanov called what is happening a perfect storm. In June, revenues from oil and gas exports fell to their lowest level in 2.5 years, down 33.5% compared to the same month last year. That amounts to about $5 billion, the finance ministry said. Oil and gas revenues fell by almost 17% or more in the first half of the year. The main reasons are the decline in oil prices and the strengthening of the ruble, the exchange rate of which is kept at around 80 rubles per dollar. Against the background of these trends, there are forecasts about the possible inability of the budget to finance military operations. Igor Vladimirovich, how realistic are these concerns?
Причина падения – это, конечно, низкие цены на нефть, и говорят о том, что вроде также влияет на это укрепление рубля, курс которого держится там 80 рублей за доллар или ниже. И это породило прогнозы о том, что скоро бюджет Российской Федерации столкнется, вообще с отсутствием средств для ведения войны.
The situation is complicated. Last November, the budget for 2025 was approved with a deficit of 1.2 trillion rubles. By May, it became clear that the forecast did not stand up to reality, and the deficit was increased to 3.8 trillion. As of June, it is already 3.7 trillion. To stay within the limits, the government needs to cut monthly expenditures by 6.5%, which is practically impossible. If it goes on like this, by the end of the year, the deficit will amount to 7.8 trillion rubles. With a total budget of about 40 trillion rubles, every fifth ruble will be unsecured. The sources of covering the deficit are not obvious. It is possible to raise such a sum on the domestic market through bond issues, but it is extremely difficult.
Будет не хватать 8, значит, считайте, что каждого 5 рубля для финансирования госрасходов будет не хватать. Где эти деньги взять, довольно сложная история. Одолжить такую сумму большую на российском рынке, продавая ценные бумаги, можно попытаться, но это будет очень сложно.
Russian banks are in no hurry to buy federal loan bonds in large volumes, which creates a problem with financing government spending. The option that is being discussed is the replacement of government spending with bank loans, i.e., funds of the population. This means shifting the financial burden from the state to the banking sector. To explain by example, regional budgets are formed from local taxes and federal subsidies. The Kemerovo region is in distress, where the coal industry is on the verge of collapse, enterprises are bankrupt, taxes do not come in, and the budget is empty. Formally, the federal center should provide assistance by redistributing funds in the form of transfers, but the mechanism fails, and the regions are left without support. The government has obliged Sberbank and VTB to provide the Kemerovo region budget with a loan of 25 billion rubles. The probability of repayment is extremely low, but the banks are forced to issue it because they are managed by the state, despite their formal independence. Thus, the financial problems of regions, companies, and industries are shifted to the banking sector. This is a new stage of the crisis. The budget deficit is compensated at the expense of the bank's resources, which actually save the economy. In the future, this may lead to a banking crisis, after which the banks themselves will have to be rescued. This will probably become a reality next year. And if we freeze the deposits of Russians, will the situation improve? The government wants to finance the budget at the expense of citizens. An article I published in the Moscow Times describes ways of implementing this idea. a whole package of solutions is already being discussed. One of the proposed mechanisms is the conversion of Russian deposits from ordinary deposits into irrevocable savings certificates. Unlike a deposit, which can be withdrawn at any time, albeit with loss of interest, the certificate does not provide for early withdrawal. Previously, the term of their validity was up to 3 years. Now the president proposed to increase it, for example, to 5. The interest on such an investment will be slightly higher, as will the insurance coverage, but access to the funds is limited.
Вместо депозита иметь безотзывный сертификат, ну, скажем, на 5 лет. Проценты по нему будут немножко выше, страховая сумма будет выше.
Funds invested in irrevocable certificates cannot be accessed for 5 years. In essence, this is a freeze. The authorities are developing measures to encourage citizens to abandon available forms of savings in favor of less liquid instruments, including shares in state-owned companies. The main goal is to force the population to finance public expenditures, for which there are no funds in the budget. All revenues are directed to military needs. Thus, a model is being formed in which the savings of citizens are used in the interests of the state. The issue of trust in Russian banks is becoming relevant. Many argue that the level of trust is preserved, but the situation is ambiguous and citizens' reactions may change.
Очень интересный вопрос. Вы знаете, очень любопытно, история довольно странная. С одной стороны, некоторые мои коллеги говорят, ну что вы, россияне очень доверяют российским банкам.
The volume of transfers by Russians to the accounts of foreign brokers carrying out operations with securities has risen sharply. The central bank expressed concern. The process is risky and complicated, but citizens continue to convert rubles into foreign currency and transfer funds abroad. People are wary of keeping their savings inside the country for fear of confiscation. Despite this, there is an opinion that the volume of savings is growing. However, it is worth paying attention to the structure of savings. The vast majority of Russians have minimal funds, and if a family has 400,000 rubles, it is considered a high level of wealth. The bulk of savings is concentrated in a limited number of depositors.
Имеет крохотные сбережения, то есть если у семьи есть 400 тысяч, то это очень такая богатая российская семья считается. Ну вот, а у большинства даже таких сумм нету, да? А значит, большинство сумм сбережений принадлежит очень маленькому числу вкладчиков.
According to various estimates, about 5 to 10% of Russians have significant savings, which are kept in the country not out of trust, but for a rainy day, if it will be impossible to access foreign assets. The main capitals have long been withdrawn abroad. In their accounts in Russia, they have amounts from 3 to 10 million rubles available for emergencies. The overwhelming majority of the population does not have such opportunities, and those who keep such sums make up a narrow layer of the ultra-wealthy. Their income from interest reaches about 6 trillion rubles, but this is only a small part of the entire financial picture. The rest of the population is in an extremely vulnerable position. It is curious to see how the situation will develop. Returning to the topic of the budget deficit, amid the shortage of funds, there was a little noticed news. The Ministry of Finance reported that the liquid part of the National Welfare Fund increased by 1.3 trillion rubles in June. The increase in liquid funds of the NWF is due to two factors. The first is additional oil and gas revenues received at the end of last year, due to a higher price than the established cutoff. The second is the recalculation of the ruble valuation of gold. Its value is growing, and the NWF contains a significant amount of gold, which increases its ruble value. The situation is likely to worsen next year. The outlook for oil prices remains unfavorable, and oil and gas revenues may decline. Rosneft, for example, based its current plan on a price of $45 per barrel, and next year it is targeting $42 to $43.
Они также будут получать средства от продажи нефти и газа вот, уже на следующий год.
Вот смотрите, значит, здесь много факторов. Значит, во-первых, с ценой картина, скорее всего, будет плохая, и доходы нефтегазовые будут плохие. Просто падает цена. Но чтобы вы понимали, значит, Роснефть заявила, что она на этот год делала план, исходя из цены реализации $45 за баррель, а на будущий год планирует 42-43.
The oil market is still on a cheapening trend, which is unlikely to change soon, so revenues from oil and gas exports will be low. Gold may continue to rise in price. It remains a reliable asset for investors around the world, especially against the backdrop of distrust in the dollar. However, yuan remains the only currency in the structure of the NWF, and China has already started a soft devaluation. This means that when translated into rubles, the value of this part of the NWF assets will decrease. As a result, oil and gas revenues will not be able to replenish the fund. The increase at the expense of gold will be insignificant, and the yuan will shrink. The central bank warns that by the end of the year, the NWF may be practically exhausted. The Ministry of Finance will probably not allow this to happen, leaving a symbolic amount, but the real liquidity of the fund will be extremely low, about 2 and a bit trillion after the planned withdrawals. With a deficit of 8 trillion, this is clearly insufficient. There are practically no alternative sources, and the authorities will be forced to turn to the funds of the population. If the West hits the West with banking sanctions now, who will suffer? Bank sanctions are in effect, but Russians have learned to circumvent them. The economy has formed a second circuit, the foreign part, where funds from the export of oil and other resources remain outside the country. The exporter receives foreign currency proceeds to a foreign account and does not transfer them to Russia. This amount is 2 to 3% of the total foreign currency proceeds. These funds are then sold to importers who need to pay for supplies from China. It is impossible to transfer yuan from Russia directly to China. China rejects yuan from Russia as impure, but payments from India or Brazil can be used to pay China. The importer pays China and returns rubles to Russia. This parallel system bypasses bank sanctions, complex and costly, but effective, so stricter sanctions are unlikely to change much. Putin announced plans to cut military spending that could affect next year or the next 3 years, but did not give an exact timeline. His announcement came shortly after Economy Minister Reshetnikov said the country was on the verge of recession. The question arises, with the shortage of funds, can the leadership abandon the contract army, leaving the conscription model and sending people to the front without full monetary support? Under the current financial pressures, such a scenario looks increasingly likely. The threat exists, and the situation is serious. Contractors already cost the budget about 2 trillion rubles, while 1.5 trillion rubles are allocated for medicine and education. Expenditures are growing and are estimated to reach 4 trillion by the end of the year. This is worrisome because the funds are used to pay for military labor, soldiers in the trenches, but not for the production and development of weapons. It is discussed that such spending is inefficient and needs to be reconsidered. The issue of partial mobilization remains open. The decree on it has not been revoked and remains in force, although it is not yet applied.
Поэтому вопрос о возврате к идее частичной мобилизации – эта идея не закрытая, потому что еще раз напомню, указ Путина о частичной мобилизации не отменен. Он действует по полной форме до сих пор. Просто его пока не реализуют.
If necessary, the mobilization decree can be used again, and people will be sent to the front again without full provision. This is a real threat given the deteriorating financial situation. The question is whether the country will be able to withstand the next wave of conscription. A new approach has emerged. Instead of import substitution, a process that can be called replacement of Russians is being launched. The authorities are promoting the idea of recruiting foreign labor. Citizens are being sent to war, and instead of them they are planning a massive importation of people from other countries, including large-scale projects to invite North Korean labor migrants.
На Украину, а вместо них начинают завозить людей из других стран. Значит, вот объявлены очень большие планы завоза северокорейцев.
Over 150,000 labor migrants and up to 1 million from India are planned to come to Russia, with labor from Africa and Burma also considered. This creates a model where Russians fight in the war, while foreigners fill the labor market with lower wages, staying out of politics. It forms a new social construct, replacing the population with vulnerable migrants as natives face the front lines. Are these foreigners to be used as a labor force or sent to war? At the first stage, foreigners are attracted as a labor resource, but over time the national structure of the population changes. The issue of fertility in this context is not a joke at all. 20 years ago, when I arrived in the Far East, I heard opinions that a Chinese man was considered an ideal partner for a Russian woman. He did not show aggression, treated children with love, gave all his earnings to the family, and was perceived as more reliable than Russian men in many respects. Even then, women were already looking carefully in the direction of neighboring China. Therefore, talk about the changing national composition of Russia is not an exaggeration, but a reflection of profound processes. One wonders why Chinese women seem more attractive when they receive payments, cars, and other support from Russian servicemen, suggesting an underlying economic model. A Russian man can become a father, but often leaves the woman to raise the children alone. In contrast, a Chinese man actively cares for the child and values fatherhood as very important. 5 to July 6th, Russia suffered losses of about $250 million due to airport shutdowns, Kommersant reported, citing industry experts. The cause was attacks by attack drones and the implementation of the carpet plan, which resulted in 287 flights being cancelled, including 171 in Moscow. The question of the scale of damage to the economy remains relevant. Air traffic interruption affects logistics, employment, domestic trade, and the tourism industry. The frequent application of the carpet plan is alarming. It is increasingly becoming a factor in destabilizing civil aviation. People are beginning to realize that serious events are taking place in the country. Previously, many people preferred to think that everything was fine, as if the problems were somewhere far away and did not concern them. However, when a person cannot leave the airport for 2 days, illusions disappear. The damage caused by the revenue deviation amounted to 7 billion rubles, a serious blow to civil aviation, which is already going through hard times. In an attempt to support it, the authorities have decided to reopen the airport in Gelendzhik, which has been closed since the beginning of the war, but demand for tickets is low. People also want safety. The civil aviation sector is in a vulnerable position, facing a series of crises. Massive airline closures and large-scale layoffs are expected. In the long run, there may be only one airline left, Aeroflot, as it was in the Soviet Union, and the rest will simply go bankrupt. Planes are worn out, their maintenance is difficult, flights are cancelled, there is no income. The wave of disasters will affect the whole country, especially domestic tourism. It used to be thought that giving up foreign travel would lead to an increase in travel within Russia, but without a working transportation system, this is impossible. People are faced with reality. A train can take 16 hours to travel across the Irkutsk region. It takes almost the entire vacation to get there and back. Airports are the infrastructure of connectivity, and their destruction turns the country into isolated regions devoid of mutual exchange. The question becomes not only economic, but also socio-psychological, whether there is a united country at all.
Так что в этом смысле аэропорт — это как бы элемент связанности страны. Когда разрушаются авиаперевозки, то страна становится не целостной, а такой кучкой изолированных районов, регионов, которые между собой не общаются, люди между ними не ездят. Вообще есть какая-то страна или нет, становится непонятно. То есть это, как бы, как сказать, имеет определенные социально-психологические последствия, не только экономические.
And can the Russian authorities go for a general closure of the country's airports, the most important ones, or in those regions that are often under drone attack? Or, as propagandist Solovyov says, will they look for non-standard solutions?
Ну уж какие нестандартные решения. Давайте вспоминать.
With the outbreak of war with Ukraine, all southern Russian airports were closed, and for 3 years they have remained inaccessible for flights. This is a well-established scheme due to a shortage of air defense assets capable of ensuring security. Russian patriotic blogs publish videos of Ukrainian drones and criticize the ineffective work of air defense systems. However, Russian air defense systems were originally designed to intercept nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles, not mass attacks by low-altitude drones. Countering this type of threat requires a different technological base and approach.
США с ядерными боеголовкой. Вот на это было все построено. А защищаться от десятков, от сотен дронов, летящих низко над землей, это довольно сложная задача.
Russia's air defense system cannot cope with the current challenges. Mass attacks pose threats not only to airports, but also to refineries, power plants, and food processing plants, where hazardous substances are stored. The volume of defense assets is insufficient to cover all vulnerable facilities. The war with Ukraine has changed the perception of geography. Previously, vast territory was seen as a strategic advantage that made it difficult for the enemy to advance. Now, with the advent of drones and missiles, the length of the country has become a vulnerability. The number of key facilities is large, and the ability to defend them is limited.
Сила России, беда, прикрыть эту территорию невозможно. На ней слишком много объектов, которые имеют ключевое значение, и прикрыть их невозможно полностью, потому что просто нет такого объема воздушных средств защиты.
For the first time, Russia finds itself in a situation where hostilities are taking place on its territory, without a large-scale invasion by foreign troops, and yet it is unable to defend itself effectively. Former Transportation Minister Starovoyt shot himself, and it is still unknown whether his resignation occurred before or after his death. He had previously served as governor of the Kursk region, which Ukrainian troops soon entered. Starovoyt's resignation coincided with a large-scale crisis in civil aviation. According to experts, his departure had been planned for a long time. Already in February, they started talking about the precarious position when Nikitin, now head of the Ministry of Transport, was appointed as his deputy. In addition, in the spring, criminal cases related to embezzlement at defense facilities began to be opened in Kursk Oblast. Apparently, Starovoyt was at least going to resign and possibly even be prosecuted.
По вашему мнению, чего вдруг захотели убрать Старовойта? Я, конечно, не говорю, что его убили, но как минимум посадить его точно хотели.
When the campaign to build Dragon's Teeth in Kursk Oblast began, virtually all Russian observers immediately assumed that it would be another large-scale embezzlement project. Even before the work began, it was clear that the funds would be stolen, based on the well-known principles of how the Russian government functions. The main thing in such fortifications is the ratio of cement needed to resist tanks and armored vehicles. If cheap sand is added instead, the structure will easily collapse under the tracks. Despite this, the project went ahead, and the official responsible for it remained in the political fold. He was considered a promising figure last year, and it is claimed that he had ties to the Rotenberg Group, although there is no evidence of this.
Ведь в прошлом году только правительство появилось, и все время он был как бы на виду, он был как бы даже такого, как вам сказать, до недавнего времени человек с хорошими кадровыми перспективами, потому что утверждает, что он как-то связан с Ротенбергами, доказать это не могу.
Despite his status, even such a high-ranking official was under attack and ended his life without glory. Curiously, many ministers came to the funeral. It looked like a form of silent protest. A colleague had been discredited and removed from office, but they came to express solidarity and emphasize that each of them cared about his personal fate. This is a kind of front, a quiet dissent within the highest apparatus of power. Such an unexpected gesture of the ministerial corps demonstrates the growing tension in the elite, the fear of finding themselves in a similar situation. The anecdote with the wreath from Putin gave the funeral an absurd tinge. Now every official realizes that he or she is at risk. The question arises, is this a fight against corruption, or are there deeper reasons for what is happening?
Анекдот с венком от Путина, это настолько глупо и странно, что даже обсуждать не хочется. Но вот это та самая история. То есть сейчас каждый российский чиновник понимает, что он под ударом, И все его действия теперь определяются не какой-то там разумной логикой управления страны, исключительно желанием спасти себя от судьбы страны.
Experts believe that this is about the redistribution of property and control over financial flows in Russia. The Ministry of Transport oversees shadowy schemes for the transportation of sanctioned goods, imports from China and India, illegal shipments and sea routes. Starovoyt was perceived as an inconvenient figure for Putin, so he was removed from the management system.
То есть, что Старовойт, он был невыгодный человек для Путина, и вот таким образом его убрали.
As recently as last year, Putin personally submitted Starovoyt to the State Duma for approval as transportation minister, and at the time he was considered a favored figure, allegedly linked to the Rotenberg Group. The appointment was not the result of popular choice, but came directly from the head of state. But with war, dwindling revenues, and increasing competition for financial resources within the system, every official is vulnerable. A previously promising candidate could quickly lose support if other figures seeking access to the flows he or she commanded took his or her place. Even the presence of the right patrons no longer guarantees stability. The apparatus of power is plunged into fierce internal competition.
Это значит, что теперь очень много будет людей под ударом. Никто не может быть уверен, что его не снимут, хотя за ним стоят правильные люди.
In Russia, power is rarely gained by professional merit alone. It usually requires backing from powerful patrons or large financial investments. Positions are often secured through informal deals and money, which deputies know well. Even this no longer guarantees stability, as law enforcement pursues criminal cases that harm the economy. More government resignations are expected, with officials first facing dismissal, then prosecution. Power structures hold dossiers on everyone, ready to use them in court. This system is entrenched in the state apparatus.
Сначала на отставку, потом на уголовное дело. Потому что на каждого российского чиновника, уверяю вас, есть папочка о всех его прегрешениях, по которым его можно легко отдать в суд и потом отправить в тюрьму. Это так устроен государственный аппарат России.
Еще одна загадочная смерть в России.
Another mysterious death in Russia. Transneft's vice president reportedly fell from his Moscow apartment window. Sudden deaths of top oil industry managers have increased, raising many questions.
В нефтяной отрасли они как-то, очень много их стало в последнее время.
Death looked strange. As a fan of detective stories, I immediately thought, I don't believe it, because he fell with a halter on his belt. A halter is a wearable device that monitors your blood pressure, or EKG, on a daily basis, and it records readings regularly. A person wouldn't install one before committing suicide. This indicates the intention to be treated, to take care of health. Such people do not jump from the window. Besides, the vice president of Transneft did not live in an ordinary apartment. He may have had a formal living space, but in reality, he lived on Rublevka in an elite house. Nevertheless, the death occurred there, in his alleged apartment. All this raises more questions than answers.
У него, может быть, есть какая-то квартира для приличия, но такие люди живут на Рублевке в очень неплохих домах, должен вам сказать. Но тем не менее приехал умирать в дом, значит, на Рублевке, оттуда прыгнул.
The death looks suspicious, especially considering that it is the 14th or 15th among representatives of the oil industry. A second part of the Russian economy has emerged, the shadow circuit, in which funds that do not enter the country revolve. Many companies carefully withdraw funds abroad, forming reserve funds for the owners. Last year, there was a record in dividend payments, about 1.5 trillion rubles, instead of directing them to investments, as required by the state. This may indicate a desire to convert assets into cash and move them abroad. The people who service such financial schemes are at risk. When you know too much, there is a risk of eliminating the source of information. First, they help the wealthy get their capital out, and then they become targets of a sweep. That's how this model works.
Из компании, что потом эти деньги перекачать за рубеж. Ну, а люди, которые это обслуживают, они всегда под угрозой. Ты слишком много знаешь, что называется, нет человека, нет источника ложной или не слишком хорошей информации, или, наоборот, правдивой информации, где спрятаны твои деньги. Поэтому люди сначала работают на вывод денег богатых, а потом этих людей убирают.
Donald Trump told NBC News that he will make a major announcement on Russia on Monday, also noting his frustration with Moscow and Putin. The fallout is expected in the coming weeks, with expectations spreading in Russian circles about new sanctions that Trump is allegedly prepared to impose. His latest remarks have caused a dramatic shift in rhetoric in official propaganda. Previously, Russian media saw him as an ally, thanked him for his loyalty, and called him the best US president. Now he is once again labeled as an enemy. The media say that sanctions are inevitable, but emphasize that Putin can cope with any challenges.
На то, что Трамп критикует Путина тем, что они благодарили, говорят: ой, Дональд, мы будем с тобой сотрудничать, все хорошо, ты лучший президент США, то сейчас снова Дональд Трамп враг России. Они говорят о том, что действительно санкции будут, и подают своему зомбонаселению то, что это неизбежность. Но все-таки Путин же молодец, он со всем справится. Давайте послушаем.
Priority is winning the war, not fighting inflation. The issues of engagement with Trump remain complex. Trump himself said he discussed sanctions directly with Putin in his conversation. He noted that the Russian leader is not excited about possible restrictions, although he has learned to cope with them. But we are talking about serious measures, and the probability of their introduction remains high. Sanctions may be adopted in the near future, so it is important to act with the understanding that their implementation is only a matter of time.
Сейчас мы много говорим о санкциях, и он понимает, что они могут последовать. И знаете, он профессионал. Это может произойти? Да, это может произойти, конечно.
Это может произойти, значит, нам надо считать, что это уже произойдет. Поэтому надо совершенно спокойно действовать, исходя из того, что санкции неизбежны.
Sanctions are promised to us. Is Russia now finished or not? Trump's words and his threats to Putin are reminiscent of the relationship of complicated partners. To elicit an emotional response, one of them defiantly flirts with the other. Trump talks about how Putin called him a genius and then compliments him, calling him a professional who can handle sanctions. It's like playing on the edge of love and hate. It's hard to take such statements seriously, given Trump's reputation as a thrash talker in the US. Perhaps this is a pressure tactic. He is trying to move from carrot to stick policy, gradually escalating his rhetoric to force Putin to react.
Человека, которого в Америке, если вы знаете, называют трэш-толкер, болтун, это довольно странное дело. Но посмотрим. Опять же, это может быть некий ход, чтобы заставить Путина все-таки смягчиться, что вот Трамп переходит от политики пряника к политике кнута, еще не перешел, но угрожает, вот еще совсем поугрожает, а дальше еще сильнее поугрожает.
So far, there are only statements, but no real action. If Trump really wanted to strike an economic blow, the simplest step would be to agree to lower the price ceiling on Russian oil to $45 or support the flexible discount model offered by the European Union. However, the US is not doing this, and as long as Washington's position does not change, it is hard to take the threat of sanctions seriously. Why did the Kremlin mouths get excited? They started threatening America. Let her be angry and jealous too. You discuss it in terms of rational behavior, but we have two unpredictable politicians in front of us who need to be perceived differently. The New York Times writes that it was Putin who soured relations with Trump and played his cards wrong. This is an unexpected twist. After Trump was elected, it seemed that he respected Putin and the latter would be able to get what he wanted in the conflict with Ukraine. But the calculation turned out to be wrong. According to some reports, Putin offered Trump gas flows and other resources. The West, in my opinion, does not understand Russia well. The statements of Western politicians are sometimes so inadequate that they cause bewilderment. They understand neither Putin nor Russian reality, nor the mentality of the people.
Но, видите ли, Запад очень плохо понимает Россию, как мне кажется. Я читаю высказывания западных политиков, у меня уши трубочкой сворачиваются. Настолько люди не понимают ни Путина, ни Россию, ни устройство жизни, ни поведение людей, ни их ментальность.
Western politicians operate with strange constructs, suggesting that Putin wants to end the war if a suitable compromise can be found, even on unfavorable terms. In fact, he has no intention of ending hostilities and probably intends to fight to the last citizen and until the budget is exhausted. Americans have developed the mistaken notion that there is a formula for Putin to satisfy his interests and withdraw from the conflict. but ending the war is a politically dangerous step for him, threatening to lose his position as a wartime national leader. That is why the idea of compromise is an illusion, reflecting a misunderstanding of the realities of Russian power and mentality in Western analytics. Thank you, Igor Vladimirovich, for the informative conversation and for taking the time for our broadcast. We wish you a peaceful day. We remind viewers, Igor Lipsits was with us. Share your comments, tell us how the economy is doing in your city and country. Subscribe to Igor Lipsits' YouTube channel and Telegram channel. There is always a lot of useful information there. Thank you for your attention and see you soon.